Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming and games through a feminist lens. Today I am your host Matt, and I'm joined by my friends Alex and Jem. Before we get started, if you want to support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem for some exclusive content, or you can send us a one-off donation via PayPal to our email address wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com.
Today, we are going to be talking about what should be the characters that make the games most exciting, which is the antagonists. We are the agonist, and the antagonist is the person that is working against us in some form. So I thought we'd start off by looking at what do we define as an antagonist?
It's a good question. I actually had to have a little help from our friend Google, because I always assumed it was more of a villain, and we all know what a villain is, but actually the two are distinct. And an antagonist is someone who opposes the protagonist, or say the main character, presumably, that you'd be playing, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're evil or that they'll stop at nothing to stop the protagonist. They might end up being a sort of reluctant ally or some such other manifestation, but they are not the same as a villain. So it really helped to double check that, just to get some clarity, because I'd always merge the two terms together in my head. So this will be a really interesting episode to explore, definitely, and to see the differences between those character traits and how they show up in gaming.
So can a antagonist be a villain, or a villain be an antagonist, or are they two completely separate roles? I came across the same definition, and that just makes me wonder whether they can be one and the same, or if they're just completely different.
This is where it gets interesting. It becomes a thing of philosophy, because antagonists, in physiology, an antagonizing muscle is the one that works against the agonizing muscle. So if you take it as simple as in terms of what the actual words mean, the protagonist is always you, because it's you taking action to do things, and anything that works against you in any way is an antagonist. But not all antagonists are villains, whereas I suppose all villains are antagonists, because they have to be, because you can't have a villain who, that's where it gets interesting. Can you have a villain who wants the same things that you do but does it differently? We'll come on to some things about antagonists that we find compelling in a moment. I originally started this episode as an episode about villains, and then all of this was coming from the perspective of asking about villains. But then I thought, I should probably mention antagonists as well. And then quickly realised, antagonists are far more interesting than a villain is, because a villain, that is a very loaded term. This is the evil person, this is the bad guy, this is the force of evil that we're fighting against. Whereas it's far more interesting if in, say, God of War Ragnarok, you've got Freya, and she is a massive antagonist at the start. But she's not a villain. She's not conventionally evil. There's a lot more grey area when it comes to antagonists, which is why I think it's a more interesting way to approach it.
They definitely are morally grey, and I was thinking about like Joel in The Last of Us 2, not 1 but in 2. When you think of him from Abby's perspective, he absolutely is an antagonist, and I think so. Somebody can actually be an antagonist and an ally in the same story, but when you look at it from different perspectives, and I think that's quite fun actually. And I got a quote here from The Craft of Writing for Games by Anna Megill, and she said that the antagonist isn't always a person. Sometimes it's the world itself. So I don't know if that, it could be all sorts of things. It could be the weather, or it could be climate change, or the planet. So I suppose when you think about some of the disaster movies, the antagonist could actually be the disaster, or at least part of that. I think you could probably make that as broad as you wanted. And in some ways, maybe the antagonist needs to be sentient in some way, intentional, but I don't know.
You could think about the different genres of gaming, say a platforming game, and the antagonist is the challenge of the platform, or the traps and pitfalls and bits where you get stuck and you have to climb a different way. You could make it very broad in that way. But yeah, it'd be interesting to really explore that across different genres. Obviously, when you think about people as antagonists, that often lends itself to a very cinematic story within a game.
That's a really good quote, Jem, because my perspective on particularly battle and fight scenes, but also in fiction in general, is that the world itself should be a character. The world should always be, if you've got two people fighting, you've got one side, the other side, and the environment. Because the most memorable fight scenes are ones that the environment is intrinsically linked to. So if you think of all the fight scenes in the Matrix series, I can recall pretty much, you think of a fight, you don't just think, oh, they're just in a random environment. They're in that beautiful marble like entrance room in the second one, and the dojo in the first one, and it's just awesome. So at every point, the environment should be playing a role in it as well. And weather is a massive thing that can be a force against you. This leads into this quite nicely, because we're going to start off with the things that we think make a compelling antagonist. And now that we've broadened it to going, it doesn't have to be a person, it doesn't have to be a thing, it can be a concept, it can be an environment, it can be a weather, it can be sentient, it can be unsentient. Basically anything that works against us. And then when you take that, makes it far more challenging to create something compelling, because the rule book is wide open. You go, right, you've got carte blanche to do whatever you want here, just make it interesting. And what is it that makes something we enjoy fighting against? Because that's what antagonists are supposed to be. They're supposed to be the one that you've got to be afraid of them, and you've got to want to defeat them. I'll start with Boulder is one of my favourites from God of War, because he's this mysterious force of nature when we meet him. He's this wiry, skinny little, he looks like a meth head. And he's the first big boss that you face in the new game. And then, whereas in all the other games you'd start off with, you're fighting the Hydra, you're fighting the Colossus of Rhodes, you're climbing up the walls of Mount Olympus on the back of the Titans, ready to do battle against the gods. And this one, they pack all of that gravitas into this skinny little guy. And then throughout the story, you reveal what a terribly tragic, broken person he is. And so that's one thing for me. I like tragedy. I like a really tragic antagonist. So tragedy is one thing that I like a lot.
Mm-hmm. I guess thinking about the antagonist as not a person, if I think about some of my favourite games, maybe even Journey, where your goal is to reach the top of the mountain, and the antagonist is all of the times when you feel like you're slipping further back down the mountain. There's that particular level near the end where it turns very wintry and dark, and it all becomes a bit fraught and stormy. and you're stuck in this snowstorm, effectively. And I think it builds a real sense of like desperation and futility at how small you are and how tiny you are and how powerful the wind is and Mother Nature, and how you feel almost powerless to stop it, to the point where your character collapses in the snow because they can't go on anymore. And then you're revitalised by the elders that come and surround you and shoot off up to the top of the mountain. It's got to have a sense in the arc of the story of progressing, overcoming that antagonist, or bypassing it in some way that gives you a sense and strength and power. I think that's a really important feeling. And just going from one strong emotion to the other, so a big low to a big high, it's definitely one of the most emotional games that I've played. And I think that aspect of the overcoming the antagonist of the environment, and of the sense of hopelessness as well, it's got a lot of layers to it, and I think it's very powerful.
The antagonist of the environment is such a good phrase. Also, you brought up the idea of your emotional feelings as the player, and that's probably can be antagonistic. Like if you feel frustrated, if you feel challenged, that's the emotional challenge of playing a game is in itself, on top of the puzzles that you might have to deal with or the bosses you might have to tackle. That can also be an antagonist. I think that the real importance of a antagonist is to drive narrative. So it's not just about providing something for you to fight, it's also about driving the story and giving the story depth and meaning, and it brings in all these things about the sort of moral complexity, and helps the main character to solidify their personal motivations and why they're doing what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. And I was thinking about like Cassandra from Dragon Age Inquisition, because she's a bit of an antagonist, because she has very strict moral code that doesn't necessarily gel with what the player might believe or what the main character has, and she also represents the institution, the existing status quo, and has very strong views on that. So she's not evil, she's not against you, but she does provide a sort of sounding board for your position and challenges your thoughts on whether we should do this or do that. In a game where you might be leaning towards the role play or at least the RPG elements, it helps you to go, no, I don't agree with that view, or yes, I do agree with that view. But it challenges you to actually think about it. And it's one of the things that we've talked about a lot, is about how gaming can give you that insight into different views and different perspectives. And it's quite good if a game sort of forces you to consider these things, rather than just being this constant, I'm going to tick the boxes, or I'm going to go for the best stats or whatever. An antagonist can give that depth and give another layer to the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what makes characters interesting is change. You want to see how they change and why they change, because most people don't want to change. Most people do anything they can do rather than change. And a good antagonist forces that kind of uncomfortable change, and then we don't know where it's going to go if the antagonist is good enough. And I'm going to talk about The Last of Us, particularly part 2, which you mentioned a moment ago, Jem, where it's probably the best example of a completely grey universe where you can argue in the same breath that one character is the hero and the absolute arch-villain from almost any point. And it depends on your perspective. And also, but then it also makes you care about most of these characters. So then you have to go, I care about Joel, but he's done this thing. And I still care about him. So what does that mean about me? Is there something he could do that would cause me to turn away from him entirely? And because it's a game and not real life, you can actually explore these very grey and dark areas. And Abby is a fantastic antagonist because she's the absolute antithesis to Ellie. They've both got this violent soul, but they move through the world very differently and they exist as very different people. Antagonists that you can play as is really interesting, if done well, like with Abby. And then I always like that the second, so this is similar, but it's the second in command syndrome where if you think the big bad guy's bad, wait until you kill them and see what their second in command's, because that person is always worse. It's like Negan and Simon in The Walking Dead. When you think you've killed Negan, you think, oh, yeah, I'm sure everything will be better now, when it's worse. And you think Abby's bad, then you meet Isaac, and then you meet the rest of the wolves, and then you meet the Scars, and you go, oh my God, these are the bad people. And becomes much more grey. Yeah, that's brilliant. What are the things in an antagonist that make them uncompelling, that make you go, eh? Because I realise, thinking about this, trying to come up with good examples, a lot of games that are good games, and you play them because they're good games, don't necessarily have a villain in them that is particularly compelling, but the game's still good. And I want to discuss what makes a villain forgettable or uninteresting.
I think for me, if they're too predictable, I think most stories can be quite predictable in games in the ways the characters will behave. You can see sometimes the twists coming, which kind of points to the fact that they're not really proper twists because you know what's coming. So things like Uncharted, you've got a lot of pretty predictable storylines in there because it's basing itself off of things like Indiana Jones and Tomb Raider. If you love those stories, then that's great because I'm a big fan of those types of stories, but they're not necessarily, I don't go into them expecting the unexpected necessarily. Which again, you could argue that's not a bad thing if it's what you're after. But I think if there's a character who is less predictable, it makes for a more interesting and engaging game as a whole in terms of the story. So the particular example for Uncharted is you've got a sort of dual antagonist / villain in the fourth one. So where you've got, and I think it's Ray, the main baddie, and obviously Nadine defects by the last quarter, and you can play alongside her in the DLC Lost Legacy when you play as Chloe, which is an interesting dynamic, but again, relatively predictable. And the reasons behind her defecting is that she just grows tired of being the sole representative of her father's Goonsfire company, essentially. I feel like they could have gone into a little bit more depth about it, to be honest, because it feels like it gets to a point and then they're like, oh, but we don't need to go any further into that, really. We could leave it there. But I feel like if you went into a bit more depth, then it's explored, certainly in just Uncharted 4, it would be more interesting. They do try to do it in the DLC, but they also explore more of Chloe's backstory as well, as Chloe is the protagonist in that one. So, yeah, I think definitely having a story that you don't expect for the characters involved is a good one.
I like when an antagonist becomes an ally or sees the light, like Freya does. But what I don't like is poorly contrived turning to the good side, which is what Nadine's feels like.
Yeah.
It's going, oh, they're a good person on the wrong side, and then, oh, now I'm going to not take care of my father's legacy anymore, and I'm going to be one of the good guys. That also struck me as a bit lame.
I think that any character that's too tropey, I think, just is a massive turn-off when it comes to antagonists. As you say, Alex, sometimes we play games because we know that we're not going to have to necessarily work too hard mentally, and the story is going to trip along and it's going to be reasonably predictable. But I still feel like even in those games, there's room for the surprising characters, for the characters that challenge you, the characters that make you think about your decisions. Not necessarily you as an individual player, but the character that you're playing at the very least. And I think there's nothing worse than coming up against characters where you know exactly what they're going to do the whole way through, and B, ones that are just drawing on really tired tropes. And we do have that a lot with female antagonists, of which there aren't that many, but often they are really tropey, and it's quite depressing because it's really a sign of how difficult so many of these writers find writing genuine women with genuine motivations. I think we talked about her before, but Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village, I think, was one of the ones that was frustrating because she just was very bland, really, in her. There wasn't a lot of depth to her. She was very tropey. She was very sexualized. There was just so much going on with her that was just lazy writing, really. And even though the combat game mechanics, the visualization of the character were all really fun, and I know she's a very popular character for all of that, and certainly fighting her was brilliant. I think as a character, she fell so flat, and it's such a shame because there was a lot of potential there for her to have depth that they just didn't really bother with. And I think that is this idea that we can just lean on tropes, and also that as long as the antagonist looks good or has fancy fireworks or something going on, we don't need to actually consider their motivations and their backstory. So for me, that's one of the things that makes antagonists uncompelling. And I think when they become uncompelling, they're not just disappointing, but they lose almost all of their power. So then it becomes very difficult. Why is my character being challenged by this person?
It's funny, while you were speaking, it actually made me think perhaps there is another character in Uncharted 4 that's a better antagonist, and that is the character of Elena, which is Nathan's wife, who is essentially fighting to get him to think about his marriage and whether he can keep adventuring in the way that he's been doing, or whether he needs to give more of his time, emotional investment into making the marriage work a little bit, which isn't necessarily a trope, I would say. I think it's the first time that I've seen an action-focused game bring up the questions of what happens when you've got a long-term relationship and you're an adventurer. What do you do? How does that work? So in that way, there is perhaps an antagonist I hadn't fully considered before. And I think it does make Nathan question whether he can keep going along with his brother now that his brother's randomly come back, and or whether he should actually pack it all in and spend time being normal with Elena. That's one of the big dilemmas that faces Nathan at the beginning of the game. He's got this actual job that he's getting paid money for, working and shipping. And shipping, it's basically a salvage, isn't it? So it's whether he wants to throw that all away and just stay adventuring, or kind of carry on trying to mend the disconnect that's happened in his relationship. So in that way, Elena definitely acts as an antagonist to force him to consider what will happen if that relationship goes away.
Yeah, that fits in perfectly with the predictable bollocks kind of thing, because when I think of a good antagonist, I think, I have no idea what's going to happen next. I have no idea what the next word out of their mouth is going to be and the impact it's going to have, or the thing that they're going to do. You just know that they're doing something that is going to be bad for you. You don't know what it's going to be, when it's going to happen. It's just that tension all the time. It's an excellent expansion of what an antagonist could be, because she doesn't want him to go off adventuring anymore. Well, she wants to have the relationship and have kids and that. And because it's Uncharted, you go, obviously it's going to be fine. They're not going to get divorced, or it'd be very unlikely that something unexpected happened, because she could die and you go, oh no, that's sad, but then that's a massive trope, so who cares? Or she could leave him, you go, well, what's the worst that can happen with that kind of thing? You go, it'll probably be fine in the end. But it sells that trope that women make your life boring. If you're in a relationship, then the woman's going to be nagging you to settle down and have a normal job and have kids and be boring. And that's frustrating.
I think it did come round to again, it's probably quite tropey, but it did come round in the end to an ordinary normal life is the real adventure ending. So yeah, again, you could argue that's too tropey, or actually it's a good message, but like, yes, you can take it either way, I think, definitely.
It comes down to that point at the start, but the antagonist can be the world. Society has these expectations, and as she's trying to get him to stop adventuring, that's because she's trying to put the brakes on his exciting life and ruin it and make him have to come home and live a normal life with her. But the reality is that's what 90% of the population are doing, living normal lives. They're not off adventuring. So I think it makes you question as the character, but also as the gamer, what is a good life? What different people are going to have different answers to that. She is forcing that conversation through that role in the game. So yeah, I think it's an interesting take on the of antagonist.
Predictable stuff is dull, and we've talked recently quite a bit about writers are constrained by the genre that they're working in, and it's rare that the writer is in charge of the project. But there's no excuse for writers to not inject some stuff that has to be good. You can't just go, oh, we just need to have a villain to stand here and say, I want to take over the world and you'll never stop me. Here are my minions, and then move on from there. Any writer worth their salt is going to go, well, I've got to do something. If the executives don't know that asking what they're asking is rubbish, they're not going to know if I put some good stuff in anyway. I think we'll bring it to a close there. Thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you everyone for watching or listening. Where to find us, watch us, listen to us. You can go onto our Patreon to look for some exclusive content, and we will see you next time. Farewell.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Gaming the System. If you want to support us, you can donate to us through our PayPal by sending it to wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com if you want to send us a one-off donation. If you want to donate to us monthly, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem. Until next time, bye-bye.